Action and reaction, cause and effect, a new technology, an unintended consequence, a new policy, a better way of managing water. In today's water webinar, we're going to hear two talks on the topic of everything is coupled, where we'll have a chance to explore the idea that the things that we do today will have consequences for years in the future, and the engineering technologies have public policy and economic repercussions the same way that those policies will alter the engineering itself. And so our two speakers are perfect people to show us the way in which systems level thinking and recognition of the coupling between our different systems can help us solve important water problems. Ilje Pikaar is a professor at the University of Queensland. His expertise involves the areas of environmental electrochemistry, the global nitrogen cycle, sewer corrosion, and next generation sludge management. He's also an expert in systems thinking about urban water management and resource recovery, with a special focus on nitrogen recovery and microbial proteins. In the past 8 years, he's been actively involved as one of the leaders of a number of important national projects in Australia, where he's been key as a leading investigator and leader of the research team at UQ. And his work on reimagining the way in which we manage nitrogen around the world has received great acclaim. And in particular, I was particularly impressed by his work that he published as a feature in the journal Environmental Science and Technology in 2017. And that feature was awarded the Best Perspective or Feature Article of the Year award.
Welcome, everybody. My name is Ilje Pikaar. I'm an associate professor at the University of Queensland. So first of all, I would like to thank the organizers for giving me the opportunity to talk today. I was given the rather difficult task to come up with a nice story around the title From Drinking to Wasting, Everything is Coupled. So indeed, everything is coupled, and that's what I will try to show today. So drinking water, well, it's very nice to have. We just opened the tap and we got very nice drinking water, and often we don't think about it, what everything that needs to be done to get that. We just open the tap and it's there. But I think many of us can remember when we were younger, when your parents told you you will learn to not waste the drinking water. And when we were told that, many times we would refer to, when you waste the water, as you can see on the bottom, you literally waste the water. But often also electricity was mentioned. What I will show you today is when we drink water or waste drinking water, there's way more to it than just wasting the water or wasting the use of electricity. So I would like to start with some take-home messages. First key take-home message is, and the title says it already, of this presentation, everything is connected. Yeah, that's what I'm trying to represent here in this schematic. The other key take-home message, what this picture represents, is that in our urban water infrastructure, we have different departments, we have different technical sub-segments of our infrastructure. And often the way they are managed, operated, are really in individual silos, as you can see here. But we shouldn't do it like that. The key take-home message is we really need integrated management, because whatever we do in one technical segment of our infrastructure may or will affect downstream processes. Now, what are sub-segments? I added source water on the left, especially because of the presentation of Alistair Grinham a couple of weeks ago, that actually showed that if you use reservoirs as source water for the production of drinking water, actually it can have a significant impact on the overall greenhouse gas footprint. of drinking water production. Now, then we have drinking water production plants themselves. We have drinking water consumption and distribution. We have sewer networks, and we have wastewater treatment plants. Second take-home message. We hear a lot when we need to innovate, or we need to innovate, and we should try to think outside of the box, kind of representing, okay, let's think in a different way than people have done before, and that's the way to be innovative. All right. What I'll try to say here is that I'm not saying we shouldn't do that, but we should also think in a different way. And I go back to the times when I was young, and I don't want to generalize, but if you ask many people when you're young, who's the smartest, the most robust of the family, and it will all come back to the old mothers. So a picture of my mother over here, and I remember when I was young and I was always complaining when she said, you need to clean up your room, it's a mess. I said, Mom, I'm busy, it's not blah, blah, blah. You know how it goes when you're young. And she always used to say, well, it's very simple, son. If you don't make a mess, you don't need to clean. And that's kind of the thinking we need to get in urban water management. Try to avoid that we make a mess or generate waste. So we should not think outside of the box. We should try to think and manage in such a way that the waste doesn't get into our box. Now, what is our box? We come back to the different subsegments again. So any water that you don't use, any waste that you don't produce, you don't have to treat it. And that's really a key take-home message that we need to get. All right. I gave you the two graphs on the left about drinking to wasting, everything is coupled. I mentioned, look, don't waste the water because it costs energy. Way more than that. In the next slide, I'm going to show even more, but on the right, you see two pictures from aqua minerals. On the bottom right, it's iron-rich drinking water sludge, and on the top, it's used activated carbon sludge, and that's used to clean the water. So in a simple way, the more water you need to produce, the more of this type of waste you make. Yeah, so it's not only electricity, it's not only the water, they also things like this. Yeah, you need to deal with it, you need to manage it, which obviously comes with costs. All right, but there's more than that, but I thought these pictures give a nice representation of the type of residuals that we produce when we produce drinking water. I have to thank Aqua Minerals again. So you see the logo on the bottom here. So they did a very great study where they looked at, okay, let's have a look at our drinking water production and distribution, which you can see in the middle. And we know how much raw water we need to produce the amount of drinking water that we consume, right? And to do so, we have a certain amount of inputs, which you can see on the left, and a certain amount of outputs, which you can see on the right. Let's not pinpoint on all of the numbers and type of inputs and outputs, but you can clearly see that there are a lot of inputs and a lot of outputs in order to produce the drinking water that we use. Okay, so yes, we do see the electricity there, but there's diesel, there's gas, activated carbon, sand, calcium carbonate, other types of chemicals. So there's a whole lot of materials and energy that goes in to produce our drinking water. So if we produce less drinking water, we need less of those inputs. Similar story on the outputs. Okay, so this is really, really great study, and I want to highlight the importance of reducing our drinking water consumption. So if we reduce that, you see we can significantly reduce the inputs that we need. So Australia was a very nice example. So when I came to Australia in the end of 2008, Queensland was suffering from a drought for many years, and as such, a big initiative, a water recycling initiative, was introduced. In total, I think the investment of infrastructure was in 5 billion, can be a bit more, can be a bit less, but a significant amount of money, as you can see. And it was really needed. But then, I don't know, it was not because I came, but of course, but it literally started raining for the coming 6 years. But during the drought, we had water restrictions. So the water consumption used to be about 330 liters per person per day. And during the restrictions, we were allowed to use about 165 liters per person per day. Well, then it started to rain. So the restrictions were lifted after a couple of years. But the reality is, people got into the habit of using less water. And now we're still around 165 liters per person per day. So what does it mean? We basically reduce the amount that we use by 50%. Now, think about that and then have a look at this picture. Then you can see the amount of resources beyond electricity and water itself that we can actually save. Okay, so kicking in an open door, but you can have a massive impact when we reduce the amount of drinking water that we use. That goes way beyond the drinking water itself and the energy. Well, I'm going to highlight iron chloride, and that's for a reason, because here we just talk about the drinking water production itself, but the choices that you make there, how you treat it, will have an impact on downstream processes as well. And iron chloride is a great example for it. All right, so we talked just about the drinking water production. Changing the amount, reducing the amount of drinking water that we use can have an impact within drinking water production itself. Key question is, do we have flow-on effects? So whatever we do in a drinking water production, can it affect the drinking water distribution consumption? Can it subsequently have an impact on sewers and have an impact on wastewater treatment plants? Well, the answer, in my humble opinion, is yes. And I did mention it before already. So if that is the case, we really need to move to a true integrated management approach that doesn't look only at drinking water, doesn't look only at sewers or wastewater treatment plants, but look at it as a whole. All right. So I thought it would be good to focus on one case study or one story, so to say, to demonstrate that everything is coupled. And I would like to focus on the sulfate story. So I mentioned to you before, we should not think outside of the box, but think in a way that sulfate doesn't get into the box. And I'm going to demonstrate why this is so important. It is important in the context of sewer corrosion. So this is now a quite famous picture, I believe. But ultimately, sulfate is the cause for sulfite-induced sewer corrosion, which costs billions every year. So we looked into that and we found a key culprit. No, and the key culprit are not the woman. It's the way we treat our source water to produce drinking water. So I'm going to explain it a little bit more. So, well, I mentioned already, sewer corrosion is a multi-billion-dollar problem. In Australia, it's about 100 million a year. It's probably even more now. But in the US, you talk about multiple $billions a year. So that's the US alone. So a major problem. Now, how does it work? I don't want to go into too much detail, but ultimately you can see here sulfate. So it was kind of accepted that it's universally present in domestic wastewater. And the same can be said for organic carbon. So when you have organic carbon, you have sulfate. Under anaerobic conditions, you can get sulfate reduction by the biofilm present on the sewer pipes and produce dissolved sulfite. And that can be emitted in gravity sections of the sewer network to H2S. I think most of you know H2S. It's the rotten egg smell. So it causes odor complaints. But as well on the top of the crown of the gravity sewer pipe. There's also a biofilm, a different type of biofilm, which can actually oxidize that H2S to sulfuric acid. Well, sulfuric acid attacks the concrete, and over time this corrodes, and ultimately it results in the collapse of a sewer pipe, as you can see on the right. Of course, this is a slow process, yeah, but our sewer networks have been implemented in some places for over 100 years ago, and when severe corrosion occurs, actually sewer pipes can corrode away within 20 years. Okay, so that's the mechanism behind it. So I mentioned that we kind of accepted that sulfate is universally present in wastewater, but we were wondering, where does it come from? Well, when we look at drinking water production, the majority of all the treatment plants use coagulants. There are multiple around, but most of them use either aluminium sulfate or iron chloride. Now, you produce a waste sludge out of that, which needs to be disposed of. The question that we asked ourselves is, does the choice, yes, so aluminium sulfate or iron chloride, would that affect downstream processes? Because the chloride and the sulfate remain in solution. So if you look at the chloride, you have the drinking water, consumption ends up in the sewer, ends up at the wastewater treatment plant. Similar for the sulfate, but you can already see here that the sulfate in the sewers can be reduced to hydrogen sulfide, as I explained, but that can also happen in the anaerobic digesters at the wastewater treatment plant. So I think it's a valid question to ask, does the choice have an impact on downstream processes? Well, very simply said, the less sulfate, the better in terms of reducing the potential for sewer corrosion and hydrogen sulfide production. Okay, so in that sense, more chloride and less sulfate, so using iron chloride and not aluminium sulfate, is good. But it would be good if life was that simple. But actually what we found is that actually for the drinking water distribution system, the opposite can be true. Because we can have lead corrosion, and that is affected by the chloride and sulfate concentrations. Okay, so whatever you do, potentially, I say potentially here, can have an impact on downstream processes. So let's first focus on the drinking water distribution. I'm not sure if you heard of it, but it was quite a lot in the news in 2016. So what had the so-called Flint disaster, and what happened was there was a switch in water supply from Lake Huron to the Flint River. And what they also did is they actually stopped the anti-corrosion chemicals that prevents lead corrosion. As you can see here, so solubilized lead from being released from the interior of water pipes, particularly those from lead service lines or those with lead solder. So what happened was the source water had a different sulfate and chloride ratio than the previously used from Lake Huron. And as a result, believe it or not, this is really the picture on the left. This is literally how the water looked when it came out of the tap. So then we digged into a little bit more, and it's not the first time that that this was known. This is a paper from 2004 from Mark Edwards. He already highlighted that lead corrosion is a major issue in drinking water distribution systems. It's a grand challenge for the 21st century. Let's go back way in time. It was actually already known during Roman times. So during Roman times, actually the rich got sick, lead poisoning, because we used lead in the Roman times for the drinking water distribution system that they had. Why we use lead? It's a very amendable metal and easy to work with. Now, so we kind of did not learn from the past, so we did change things. So the main The main water pipes were not made of lead anymore, but we still have lead soldering, or in private, especially private plumbing, and also in the service lines from the main lines to the households. So the good thing is we can avoid it by using different types of soldering materials, not using lead, and we can use lead corrosion inhibitors. Okay, obviously that comes with a cost, but they are effective. Now, that was the problem with the Flint case study, that they stopped the anti-corrosion chemical dosage. Well, to put it very simply, chloride to sulfate mass ratio does have an impact on the potential for lead corrosion. So basically, the higher the chloride the higher the chloride, the worse it is. Yeah, so here's a maximum limit of 0.5. It's a bit simplistic. It depends on all the factors in the water, like alkalinity and other things. But in general, it is correct. The higher the chloride, the lower the sulfate, the worse it is. So sulfate good, chloride bad. Now, this is a nice example. What we talk about, everything is coupled, right? This is a very nice example. Oh, they used alum dosing for 6 years. Then they changed the coagulants. There was a reason for it. Can be cost, can be a better performance at the point of dosing. Just looking at, in this case, most likely natural organic matter removal, not taking into account the potential impact on the drinking water distribution system. So you can clearly see lead concentration go up, and then they stopped again, and they switched it back to aluminium, and you see that a clear impact on the lead concentration. Well, obviously they did not dose corrosion inhibitors. They could have done, then the situation would have been different. So be aware, it can be solved, but it obviously comes with a price, the dosing of anti-corrosion inhibitors. Now, what's also very important, in my opinion, to do is always, okay, how big is the problem that we talk about, or how much are we using in the bigger scheme of things? Well, when we look at coagulant dosage, this is an older graph on the top, but this shows you the amount of different types of coagulants used. Yeah, and in Australia, it's mostly aluminium. Similar for the US, about 80% actually is based on alum. So that's the relative distribution is important, but also the total amount. I just highlighted one country from 2007 data from the UK. So key message here is we talk about a fair bit of coagulants that we dose. In total, considering a cost of over $1,000 per ton as Fe or alum, we're really talking about a multi-billion-dollar market here. So we can have a big impact. All right, so let's go back here. So we did discuss the potential impact of the choice of alum or iron that it can have on drinking water distribution system. Let's focus now on the sewer networks. So we did a study and said, okay, where does the sulfate come from? We know it can be added by the addition of aluminium sulfate, but let's have a look how much that really is. So we were kind of lucky because we were measuring sampling wastewater without knowing this. It was really for another reason, for research purposes, but we analyzed the wastewater composition literally for a couple of years every week. So we were lucky that we were able to get the drinking water composition as well, the source water that is, and also after treatment of a local drinking water production plant. And what we found was quite striking. So only 12% of the sulfate that's present ultimately in the sewage comes from the source water. 60% actually comes from coagulant dosing, and 28% comes from waste. So waste, you can think about personal care product and things like that. So this is not a one-time off measurement, as you can see. It's like really a 3-year measurement in one area, and that area only receives water. The sewage only receives water from households, so no industrial discharge. That is nice. That's just one location, but we wanted to see the bigger picture, and then we did a national survey in Australia. So basically all the bigger cities in Australia. And what we found was, again, quite striking. So let's look at the source water. So here you can see the typical concentration of sulfate in the source water. On the left, you have treatment plants without alum dosing, and on the right, you have treatment plant with alum dosing. And then here we go. Poof. What do we see? Again, similar story that we found for our monitoring campaign in one location. In most of the cases, the addition of aluminium has a massive impact on the sulfate levels ultimately in the sewage. So now we go from a single location to a national phenomena. That is nice, but we wanted to do more than that. So we also did a literature study on the chemical usage in other countries, such as the US, and we found a similar story that most of the utilities actually use aluminium sulfate. And that's nice. So we wanted to, that's nice to know, but then we wanted to do model it into a global context. So based on the data that we found, we did a lot of modeling. Don't want to go into too much detail here, but sewer networks have different hydraulic retention times. And we mimic that, and we just assumed a scenario where we replace alum with iron. So about 60% of the sulfate gone. And we even mimic a situation where we actually removed sulfate from the source water. Yeah, well, that is actually not really a weird scenario when you think of it, especially in places when we have desalination for drinking water production. Now, we did all that, and without going into too much detail, you can see here clearly that actually the average dissolved sulfate concentration are much lower when you don't dose alum. Now, we did a similar modeling or simulation and estimation on how that would refer to the amount of concrete loss due to sulfate reduction. And ultimately, we were very proud and happy to be able to publish this in Science. I think the reason that it got into Science is that it was so simple, right? So life doesn't always have to be very complex. I'm not saying it's very, very simple, but it's very easy in a way to change just the type of chemical that you dose rather than reinventing the whole way we treat water, new infrastructure, etc., etc. All right, but that's not the end of the story. Let's have a look where alum or iron is dosed elsewhere in the urban water cycle. So it's dosed for sulfite control in sewers, and it's dosed for phosphate removal and sulfite control in digesters. So our question was, okay, if we use iron chloride during drinking water production, be careful about the impact on the drinking water distribution system. Never forget that. But then the waste sludge, can we use that waste sludge rather than get rid of it? Can we actually use it to replace iron chloride? Now, the first tests were already 6 years ago, so we got some drinking water sludge, and we did some batch tests in the lab, and the baseline, the black line, is the sulfite production, in the sewer reactors, and then we just dose different molar ratios of iron-rich drinking water sludge, and you can clearly see that yes, it is efficient in removing sulfite. So in a way, no surprises there, but we proved under very controlled conditions in a scientific way, yes, first beneficial reuse of drinking water sludge. Now, then we made it a little bit more complicated in the sense that we operated a continuous system for a long time, as you can see here. So we first operated for a very long time in kind of a baseline, so no dosing at all. And then we started to add drinking water sludge in phase 2, and you can clearly see the impact on the dosing of the drinking water sludge. Well, you can see we don't remove everything. So key take-home message here, don't think it doesn't work properly. No, it did. But what we didn't want to do, we did not want to overdose the system. We really wanted to accurately assess if we add this amount of drinking water sludge with this amount of iron, how much sulfite can we remove? And then we were able to compare that with the situation when you actually dose virgin iron chlorides. Okay, so that was the aim of that. And we conclusively proved that it really works. Then the second use, a similar study, then ultimately, if we dose the drinking water sludge in the sewer, it ends up at the wastewater treatment plant. And then if you aerate it, the sulfite gets oxidized to sulfate again. And then the iron theoretically would be released and become available for phosphate removal, which you can clearly see here as well. Okay, so we conclusively proved, again, in the lab with controlled conditions, so scientifically sound, that we can really reuse drinking water sludge for a second purpose, and that's for phosphate removal. Similar study again. We looked at, okay, that's nice, that's very nice actually, we remove phosphate, but ultimately if we digest the sludge, the iron will be ending up in the sludge, and under anaerobic conditions, sulfite can be formed, and the solubility product of sulfite is lower than that of phosphate. So theoretically, phosphate should be released and sulfite would be captured again. And this is exactly what we saw indeed in phase 2 on the right. So the sulfite concentrations clearly were reduced. The other good thing expected is that it didn't have an impact on the methane production. So we demonstrated that we literally can reuse drinking water sludge 3 times. So instead of wasting it, of this disposal in a landfill, for example, we can add it to a sewer and then reuse it 3 times. Now, we won an innovation prize for that. And then the question is, are we really innovative, or are we just reinventing the wheel? The same Mark Edwards that dedicated his career later onwards on lead corrosion in drinking water distribution had a very nice study published in 1997 with data from 1991 that we actually can beneficially discharge of iron coagulation sludge to sewers for sulfite control. Now, here's a picture. So we talk about 91, so 30 years ago, before we did our work, but this is full scale. What is nice here is that they added no sludge, then alum sludge, and then ferric sludge. And without going into much detail, this picture shows that when dosing iron drinking water sludge in the sewers, it actually you control the sulfite in the digesters. So are we reinventing the wheel? To a certain extent, but sometimes it's important. We went a step backwards and really assessed it on a scientific level in the lab to really accurately assess what is going on, how much sulfite can we remove, etc., etc. And this is the implementation at full scale. So that's a different story. But it's always nice to see that people have tried it in the past and it actually worked. it also highlights one of the key take-home messages that I said, integrated management, but it's also communication, right? So get the word out there. Not everybody was aware of this. I made some phone calls after with some contacts I have in industry in Europe, and indeed, some utilities actually those or sell their iron-rich drinking water sludge to wastewater utilities to not necessarily avoid sewer corrosion, but actually to mitigate odor problems in sewers. So it does happen at full scale, but it's just scattered, and we need to get the word out there. We need to communicate more effectively between research, R&D, and industry. So my answer, yes, it's still innovation. We did not fully reinvent the wheel. And let's get success stories like this out there so everybody can benefit. Okay, so nevertheless, this is great. Sorry, let's go. No, let's go back to this one. So that is great. We can beneficially reuse and reduce the waste. Nevertheless, ladies and gentlemen, the amount of drinking water that we produce has a flow-on effect. So the less drinking water produced, the less amount of waste sludge we produce, the less amount of waste that we have, and there's always too much waste sludge than the amount that we need in the sewer. So yes, it's great if we can reuse resources, but we still, our first thought should be, let's not get the waste into our box, into our system. All right, then ideally, we would like to recover the iron then at the end of the wastewater treatment plant, and then recover it in such a way that it can be reused again during the production of drinking water. So can we close the loop? Even when we can close the loop, that would be really ideal. Think about it. Don't think, oh, we can close the loop so we can use as much as you want. No, there's still a necessity to minimize the use of coagulants in the first place. Yeah, so this is quite nice. So in recent times in Europe, Vivionate formation in anaerobic digesters has become a hot topic. Why? Vivionate is an iron phosphate speciation, and it's actually magnetic. So theoretically, this should enable us to selectively separate Vivionate from the sludge through magnetic separation. Well, PhD student Thomas Prof has been doing very impressive work in recent years, so I recommend to read some of his papers on this topic. And he proved that indeed you can separate Vivionate from sludge. When you selectively separate it, you can then separate the phosphate from the iron, you recover the phosphate, and you can potentially reuse the iron. Now, when we were reading those studies, I said, oh, this is very interesting. And the key question to ask there would be, do we form Vivionate in the same way when we dose iron-rich drinking water sludge to sewers that ultimately ends up in the digester, compared to iron dosing at the treatment plant that ends up in the digesters? If the answer is yes, we're getting somewhere. And thank God, the answer was yes. So on the top, you see the reactors where we dosed iron chloride. And on the bottom, you see the reactors where we dosed iron-rich drinking water sludge. I have to say, these are the same reactors, the continuous systems that we used. So in total, these systems have been running for, I think, 4 years. In the beginning, we have baseline, then we dosed iron chloride back into steady state. We stopped the dosing for a couple of months, and then we repeated experiments with iron-rich drinking water sludge. At the time when we started this project, we were not aware of the Vivionate. So again, it's about communication, collaboration, and we were lucky that we had the samples and we had the system in place to actually investigate this. So what you can see here is that Vivionate is formed in a similar amount and to a similar percentage in the sludge in the activated of our anaerobic digester. There are ways to further optimize the amount of vivinate that you can produce. I'm not going to talk about it today. I would like to refer you to the studies of Thomas Prof, who investigated this. But the key message is, yes, iron chloride or iron-rich drinking water sludge, ultimately we form vivinate during digestion, which gives us the opportunity to actually recover this vivinate, which we did, and then we actually added it back to the sewer to prove that we can remove sulfide again. So that's really, really great. But nevertheless, as I mentioned, it's great to have a circular loop, reducing the waste, but the key is still, as a concluding remark, we should try to think in a way that the waste doesn't get into the box. The other key take-home message at the beginning and also concluding remark here is that, look guys, everything is connected. We often manage our urban water infrastructure in a segregated way, so individual departments. We look at the drinking water production, the sewage and the wastewater treatment plant, and we often simply look at optimizing at the point of dosing without considering the potential impacts it can have on the other technical subsegments of our infrastructure. So lastly, communication and collaboration. And with collaboration, I mean interdisciplinary collaboration with scientists, but also collaboration with scientists, utilities, and industry, and collaboration within the different departments of our urban water infrastructure. So the drinking water utilities, with the wastewater utilities, with sewer operators. So with that, I hope I convinced you that from drinking to wasting, everything is coupled. I hope I gave you a little bit of the bigger picture, and that you enjoyed this presentation. Lastly, I talked about collaboration, acknowledgement. There would be a lot of slides of acknowledgement if I would mention all the researchers involved. In this case, I would like to restrict it to our industry partners. Without their valuable input and cash contribution, obviously, none of this would have happened. So with that, thanks a lot, and thanks a lot for your attention.
Our second speaker today is Koen Schoors, a professor at the University of Ghent. Professor Schoors is an economist and professor. He's also the director of CERISE, the Center for Russian International Socio-political and Economic Studies. His main area of research is related to corporate restructuring, and he's also an expert in the topic of economic crises. He regularly appears in the media and a commentator on socio-economic events, and we're particularly interested to hear his perspective on the way in which economics and water come together, because after all, everything is connected.
Hello everybody, my name is Koen Schoors from Ghent University, and I will talk about liquid thrust. The H is not accidental, obviously. What I intend to do is to talk about a research project where we are going to analyze the relation between access to water and informal institutions, like trust. Let me start with referring to Maud Barlow. Maud is a Canadian writer and water activist, and her latest book is indicated there on the right, entitled Whose Water Is It Anyway? The point she makes throughout her career and her life is essentially that in our Western countries, water has been privatized into water rights, and through that privatization, it has been commercialized also and basically commodified. Water is a commodity. We use it as a good. It comes out of the tap for free almost, and we are not thinking about the underlying value or what it means to our society. And she uses the word the myth of abundance. So she claims that By having water so easily accessible, so almost invisible, there is a myth of abundance. People don't think of something that could be exhausted, don't think about the depletion, and this leads to excessive use. And this is the problem we have with water today in Western societies, and that's why our countries often are drying out and are having new problems of scarcity. What she basically does is she says we should have a different approach to water. Our approach should be based on conservation first. So we should not use water as if it's for free. No, we should focus on conservation. That means use it smartly. That means replenish the watersheds, not just evacuate all the water as quickly as you can to the sea through sewage, but actually replenish the watersheds and basically rainwater catchment as much as you can. She also argues for a re-municipalization of water. So she says, look, we have given control to big multinationals, companies through this privatization process, and we should restore local public control. We should, in fact, restore water as a common. And that brings us, of course, to later on Elinor Ostrom. But first, let's look in the world, indeed, whether there are such differences in water intensity. And water intensity is the usage of water per person per day in liter. And in this map here, you can see the color code, dark blue, is the heaviest usage. And you see, of course, that the dark blue countries are, not surprisingly, desert countries like Egypt or Saudi Arabia or Central Asia or Australia, but also to some extent a country like the United States or Canada. So water usage is not only linked to dry circumstances, but also to welfare, to countries where water is basically commercialized, privatized, and used excessively. Which brings us to Elinor Ostrom. She got the 2009 Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences. We don't call it the Nobel Prize itself because there's no such thing as a Nobel Prize for economics, but the Swedish Riksbank founded this Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences. And her contribution, why she got this Nobel Prize, is she defined the idea, the concept of common pool resources, which later on we have started to call the commons. Of course, the word commons is a very old word, but now these two words, commons and common pool resources, are often used interchangeably. And what are common pool resources? They are goods that are rival, subtractable, which means if I use some of it, you will not be able to use it. The use of one consumer diminishes the use of another consumer, but not excludable. I cannot prevent you from using it. And water sources are one of the classic examples of a common pool resource. It's even in the word of the concept, a common pool resource. And why are these kind of goods problematic from an economic point of view? Well, the reason is, if you have these characteristics, goods that are rival but not excludable, what you typically get is free riders. And free riders are people that want to use the good, but are not willing to pay for it. Or people that use the good excessively, more than was agreed to, without wanting to pay for it. And this means you get always into problems of depletion and exhaustion if you have common pool resources. At least that was the economic point of view before Elinor came around. And how does it actually work? Well, the idea is, even if you're rational, the problem is that if I'm a rational user and I free ride, I use more than I'm supposed to use, I'm still damaging my future self. Because if I use too much water today, I myself will have not enough water in the future. And I take that into account in my decision. But I do not take into account the fact that my excessive use today may also mean that others have less use in the future. So there's an externality of my excessive use on the future use of all others. And by not taking this into account, and because nobody takes it into account, you get on an aggregate level, far too much use and depletion. And this is what has been called the tragedy of the commons. And the classical solution in economics has been twofold. Number one is, and that's what has happened to water in the West to a large extent, property rights. You're going to find property rights, water rights. You're going to divide up every drop of water, and you're going to have big companies usually distributing the water. The other classical solution could be state ownership. In many countries, the water companies are not big multinationals, but are state companies or local state companies. But Elinor Ostrom basically argued, look, this is a third way. There's a way of governing the commons. And this is one of the reasons why she got the Nobel Prize. She defined 8 principles for properly managing commons. So let's go through these 8 principles. The first one is you need clearly defined boundaries. You have to know who is entitled to access what. So you have to describe precisely who can do what. So in that sense, it comes close to property rights in a way. You don't get out of it by just keeping it vague. You have to be very specific. Second, the rules for using these common pool resources should fit local circumstances. So it means you need rules for local people fitting local ecological needs. There's no one size fits all. Rules should be tailored, adapted to the local situation. And you get this, and that's the third rule, by having participation. You have to make the decision-making process participatory. If you have participatory rules, they're usually better, and that's the reason why they're more often abided by. That's why they will work. But of course, trust is good, accountability is better. So the fourth principle is these commons must also be monitored. We must monitor the rules we have agreed among ourselves. And that's the fifth principle, if people violate the rules, if they're not abiding by the rules, there should be sanctions. And these sanctions should be graduated. You cannot exclude someone from the first moment because then the whole local thing will fall apart. No, you need a system of warnings, fines, and informal reputational consequences before you exclude people. And then if things don't get arranged by the fines, you need a system of conflict resolution. And that system should be informal, cheap, and straightforward. And one of the usual interpretations of that is there should be a form of arbitrage that solves conflicts between partners in this common. The seventh principle is there should be some way of self-determination because, okay, you have these local commons, but of course, it should be respected by higher authorities. It should be legitimized. It's no use that we agree on rules and on sanctions and on conflict resolution if later on things are reversed by higher authority. They have to accept what we decide. And that's the eighth rule. That's why they work best in the form of multiple nested layers. For example, if you think about water and in the irrigation networks, we can agree amongst us how to deal with the water we have and how to do the irrigation, how to split the water, but only if the guys upstream have not already consumed all the water. So it should be nested in a series of common pool resources, nested sequentially and also in terms of local, regional, and maybe national. Another scheme she provided, and that's really the heart of what I'm going to talk about today, that's from a science paper in 2010. She said, okay, if we have to think about managing the commons, we also have to think about how can we create cooperation between individuals. And in this scheme, in the science paper, she basically talks about, okay, you have these broader contextual variables. For example, it could be about a local irrigation project in some country. And you have micro-situational variables. So at some point within this broader problem, you have a village that has a certain access to water, and the question is going to be how they're going to distribute it and how they're going to make sure it's not excessively used or depleted to the water source. So it means you have to work with individuals, and individuals are learning and are norm adopting. So if you start a process, it's not going to be immediately finished. The group of people locally learns something, and that learning depends on trust and reciprocation. So imagine that the local people agree to use the water for a certain volume. And they for example, agree that half of the village uses it on even days, the other on uneven days, and on Sunday nobody uses water, to give a stupid example basically. So then you need to trust one another. If I do not use more than I'm supposed to, and on different days, and the other people in the village do it too, then it means that we reciprocate. I trust you trust me, and we both behave according to the rules. So that increases the level of cooperation. And that means our net benefits will be higher. There will be benefits of cooperation, because as we both stick to the rules, there is in effect enough water, and there's no need to free ride. And that feeds back into our learning and norm adopting. We adopted the new norm, and now we learn the norm actually works. So it reinforces the trust and reciprocation, the cooperation and the benefits. That's one equilibrium. But it could be wrong too. It could go completely awry. How could that happen? Imagine that there's in this village a lot of free riders, some guys that are not to be trusted, not trustworthy. So you have these people, and at night they're using too much water, and they're tapping it from the river or from the pipe, and they're using it secretly for their own gardens. That means there's cooperation from my side, but not from the other guy's side. They don't reciprocate. That means the net benefits are going to be lower, because at the end there's going to be not enough water for everybody, because some people secretly have used more. So the net benefits are going to be low, and we're going to learn that, oh, I adopted this norm, but this guy's not to be trusted. I should also be free rider. And the levels of trust reciprocation go down, cooperation becomes less beneficial, and you get like a vicious spiral. So it's a really interesting and simple scheme to make us understand that this management of the commons has multiple equilibria, and it could go good or bad. And that leads me to this idea that there's maybe an interesting convergence. In the West, in our countries, we basically are not longer in touch with the commons aspects of water. The water is something we take for granted. It's there, it's part of the environment, it's part of the invisible world we all live in. You could say, if you were a fish, it's the water we swim in. We don't see it anymore. It's been privatized, commodified, it's part of the invisible environment. And that leads to excessive use. Since we're not aware of it, we discard it all too easy because we don't understand the value. So it's too easily consumed in some ways. But in other parts of the world, the one we're going to study in Africa, the governance of water is still largely absent. And in these countries, there's a scarcity of water and a massive stress on conservation. If they don't conserve, if they don't really save water to a massive scale, they're just gonna die, because there's not enough water for everybody in the dry season. And in many cases, they don't really have a real common yet. They are currently in the process of creating or co-creating new governance systems for new water commons. And you could say, look, they're still approaching to it. We probably have to some extent return to it. So what can we learn from them? What can the West learn from them? And what can the university learn from them? Actually, this is a university water bottle we all got to remind us that water is very valuable and that tap water is great. We should not buy bottled water or just use the tap like this. So there's a lot of room for communication and mutual learning that, of course, goes hopefully further than just providing us with free water bottles. So let's have a look. One of the things we want to do is have a research project in collaboration with a non-governmental organization. The non-governmental organization is one in Ghent, our city. It's called UGent for Water. And this is a picture of one of their projects. You see the website down there. One of their projects in Benin, a poor, very poor African country. And there they installed a foot pump in the village. A foot pump is a pump where you have to stand and you stand on it and you go like up and down to do the pumping movement. And that's how you fetch water. There's a beautiful movie on the website of this lady explaining how in the past she had to spend 2.5 hours with her kid on the back to fetch water, because the water source is not far away, 5 kilometers, but she has to go on foot 5 kilometers and back with a heavy weight on her head, 35, 40 kilograms. And that would take her 2.5 hours a day. So there's a massive direct effect in terms of time and effort spent that you could basically save by having this water pump. So at the left on the screen, you see her and her friend holding a bar, and that's the bar they hold when they together pump the water. So it creates collaboration in this village. You have to collaborate to fetch the water. You also see aspects of local maintenance. You cannot have the water completely for free in a common pool resource, because then you will get excessive use. So basically you see a man there, he's the local responsible for the project, and he's basically making people pay a little amount and controlling people do not use without paying. So he's paying a little amount for the money, and the money is supposed to be used for the maintenance of the pump, of the source. So it's a self-financing system, which is why people will respect it and it will be maintainable. So to some extent it's a common pool source, but there's also a little private element there where people pay for the source. And this is how it then actually goes. You pump up the water, you put the water on your head, and you walk the water to your home. That is only, 100 meters away, and there you store it locally. So this is still a situation where there's no pipelines, right? There's no local pipelines. But what are the benefits? The benefits are obvious. First of all, you have clean water, which you can drink. On the background, you see cooking material. You can use the water to cook and to clean after cooking. So there's obvious advantages of not having to walk so far to get the water. And of course, there are massive hygienic advantages. You can wash your kids. Well, if you have no clean water or no water at all, it's very hard to be hygienic. So basically, what we wanted to do is to work with this NGO and to do a number of projects about, okay, what are the benefits, the effects and the benefits of having access to water? And the obvious things are, of course, you get access to drinking and cooking water, so that is kind of obvious. You need water to live, and so things get easier. But you also get massive health and hygiene improvements. And this is what we call WASH in modern jargon, and WASH stands for water, sanitation, and hygiene. So personal hygiene, washing hands after you use the toilet, washing hands before you eat, washing hands after you have been working in the fields, and also the cleanliness of the direct environment. If you have water, you can actually much easier clean your direct environment. You have a massive gain of time and energy, as I explained. The order of magnitude is huge. It's 2 hours a day. And also you can use the rest water, the wastewater, you could call it the gray water, of basically cleaning and maybe even cooking for your kitchen gardens. But also massive indirect effects. And we take a massive interest in identifying and measuring these indirect effects. What is the indirect effect of having a lot more time and a lot more energy? Well, what will people do with these 2 extra hours and the energy of not being tired? You could do extra work. You could work in the fields, or you could work on an extra job in the market, so you could earn income, and your earning capacity would increase. You could use the time for study. Could spend some time of studying and getting smarter, or learning to read, learning to write, learning all kinds of skills that you can use in other circumstances. You could use it on the local community, help people out, care for people, provide local public goods, play with the kids, and do stuff with the family. So there's also a household aspect. You have more time for the family. You could help your kids study. You could play with your kids. You could spend more time with your spouse or your husband. And of course, the most important one is leisure. The lady we showed in the picture before, she basically said, well, one of the most important things for me is I can sleep in. I had to get up at 5 o'clock in the past. Now I can sleep till 7 and fetch the water, and in 5-10 minutes I have the water, and I still have earlier than I had the water in the past. So, and I just have a lot more energy because I don't have to do this very hard work very early in the morning. But of course, we also interested in the whole trust thing. So what is the impact on local institutions and local social norms of having access to this water source? Of course, people will have to build it, and will have to often cooperate in building it. So that creates at least some cooperation in the village. The pump has to be maintained. Will there be a water board who is responsible for maintaining it? Who is a member of the water board? The local authorities, most likely. Maybe the users, maybe other parties also. How well will it be maintained? Hopefully there will be no corruption. Hopefully the money paid for the water will not be siphoned away to some corrupt cause, but actually go to maintain the water source. You also have aspects of water and hygiene education. What is often linked to these WASH projects is that people learn about washing their hands. You change the habits and the social norms. And washing your hands, since the water is so easily accessible now, but still in a very conserving way, as you can see, becomes a new and good habit, which all kind of positive health benefits in the long run. I talked about the collaboration already. It also increases mutual trust and social norms. If people help each other to pump, if nobody uses excessively, there's always going to be water. Of course, we know it could go the other way around. If there's a lot of distrust in the village, people will basically abuse the water, use too much, pump too much, do not not keep the agreement, and then the source will easily be depleted too fast, and it will fall apart. So it could decrease trust in one another. And the interesting thing is, why will it happen like it happens? And what is the driver of this process? It will affect the trust in the local leader who leads people into building this thing. It will, there's a question about trust in the company, because sometimes there are companies providing it. And I will talk about this in a second. And there's also a matter of trust in the local government, because often local governments are involved in building it and coordinating it and maintaining it. So the question is going to be then, okay, how will that be affected? These are very interesting questions for us. And you're lucky that at this moment, there's a kind of quasi-natural experiment going on in Uganda. In Uganda, there's a pipeline already there. The yellow line you see in this map is an existing pipeline, and it's like water coming from a tap line in Kiandaranga. I hope I pronounce this correctly, but I guess not. Kiandangara, I should say. And the green line is the extension. So there's a plan, and it's called the Kainia extensions, to extend the yellow line to the green line. There's a part of the green up on top there, and there's a very long green extension here. This is in a very remote part of Uganda where there's no easy access to water at all. And so there's going to be all kinds of issues. How are we going to manage this? Will people trust one another? If people at the end of the line, all up there, okay, these people, they have to rely on the people downstream, or upstream, I should say, don't use too much. How will it affect time spent? Because some people will be close to the tap, close to the line. Other people will be more removed, will be farther away from the line, just by accident, because the line is built where it is built. So some people will have a massive gain in time of energy spent, and for some it will be a lot worse. Will that create jealousy in the village? Will it make people move? Will it create more collaboration? All these are interesting questions. So this is something, a real project we are embarking on. And in fact, as we speak today, my colleague Bart de Floor, a professor in economics, and our student Femke are currently in Uganda, and they are prospecting there. Actually, we're doing this together with a Join for Water. The T should be gone there. It's Join for Water, the Belgian NGO, and Hewasa. Hewasa is a local NGO, and they're the one who built the first pipeline, the yellow one. And now there's a joint project between these two NGOs, extending the pipeline to many more villages in the east of Uganda. We will also collaborate with the local Mountains of the Moon University, because of course, if you're going to survey people and ask them all kinds of questions before and after the extension of the line, because that's the idea, then we will need interpretation and introduction to the local people. And of course, the Ghent University. So the idea is, okay, we have people there before that they have no access to tap water or to any line. And we have people in the same villages after. Some villages will not get the line or will get the line later. Some get it right away. So you can really study in an almost kind of, you could call it an almost experimental sense. You can test how this access to water affects people and their informal local institutions. And you can also try to understand why it sometimes works and get a good equilibrium and why it doesn't work. So the research questions are going to be how it affects time and effort spent, and especially how it affects also within the household, the bargaining power. Because of course, one of the interesting things, if we talk about norms and values to education, is of course gender equality. Because in many of these countries, the gender the gender of the person who has to fetch the water is female. It's the women who have to do all the work with the water fetching, and that's what we saw in all these pictures. So if all at once you get the tap water, the time and efforts spent is time of women. So maybe that will change the negotiation power inside the households. And that's a very interesting aspect all by itself. You reduce the burden on women, especially. You have the whole aspect of interpersonal trust and cooperation, the norms and value to education and to changing the gender roles. You have the relation to the local governance and local authorities. And the big question about the multiple equilibria I just described in the beginning of my talk, when I talked about the model of Ostrom and the local situation. So we want to study this, try to understand how these multiple equilibria work, and hopefully we learn something from it. Because in the end, it's a communication between us and them. And they are building a kind of local common pool resource. And I think we will have to do the same. We will have to go back to this local remunicipalization of common pool resources. So we are looking forward to learning how it works there and potentially to learn from them rather than teaching them. I hope this was interesting for all of you, and it was my pleasure being here. Bye-bye.